Hello and welcome to another edition of Interviews with the Author. We're here today with Paul Ritchie from Limerick. My own name is John, as you know, from Teach and we're talking today about Paul's book, Is It Unspiritual to be Depressed? Hello, Paul. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, John. Great to see you.
Good to have you on with us. So firstly, maybe starting off, could you tell the viewers a bit about yourself, where you're from, what you're doing in Limerick at the moment, and maybe up unto writing the book, maybe just your testimony, a bit about your family, just those different parts of your life.
That's great. Thank you, John. So my name is Paul Ritchie. I'm originally from Cork. I have been living in a variety of places for a while. I serve as pastor of Limerick Baptist Church, and I love doing that. I have a family. I'm married to Caroline from Dublin, 3 kids. I hope you can't hear them in the background. I can hear them in the background. But as long as they keep it down fairly good there. So I have Anya, 17 in 6th year, Ronan, 15, and Shan, 12 in 1st year. A little bit about how I came to faith. John, it wasn't until I wrote this book that I ever felt that I'd given my testimony. I don't know about you, but sometimes when you're asked to give your testimony, it seems a little bit formulaic. You say the things that you're supposed to say. They were all true. I remember in the first church I worked in when I was about 25, and I'd be asked to give my testimony. And the true version of that testimony goes like this. I grew up with parents who loved Jesus. I prayed a prayer at a Christian camp when I was 11. I didn't do much about it for my teenage years, bit of a coward. Went to college after school. I liked the Leaving Cert so much I did it twice to scrape into college. And then I get into college and I joined the Christian Union because I decide I need to figure out whether this is real or not. And I had friends who answered my questions and so on. And that was sort of the testimony I would give. But I remembered about 25 thinking, but there's a whole lot that's not going into that testimony. I didn't realize it at the time, but at that stage, I was at the beginning of struggling with a level of anxiety that would live with me for quite a few years. I was deeply insecure in the nature of God. I wondered whether I really was a Christian. I wondered whether God really had forgiven me. And so I felt always a bit of a hypocrite because I would get up and I would give my testimony, which was true, but there was so much I wasn't saying. I didn't know how to say it. I used to look at the congregation and think, but what if they knew what I was really like? And particularly, what if they knew about all these anxieties and insecurities that I had? In fact, John, I used to have a dream. Probably shouldn't tell you this, but I used to have this dream that I'd go into the center of Dungannon where I was working and I'd meet someone from the church and I'd be talking to them and then I'd find that I'm in my underpants. I'm that alone. And I presume it was one of those, imposter syndromes or something like that. What if they knew how little I knew my Bible? What if they knew how insecure I was about God? What if they knew about all the typical male sins that I struggled with and so on? And it wasn't really until I wrote this book, and the book is slightly autobiographical, but the introduction gives my story. And I think when I finally wrote that, and talked about my struggles with mental health. I didn't even know at the age of 25, I was struggling with mental health problems. That was something that grew over time. It wasn't really until I finished that book that I thought, you know what? That's the first time I've really given my testimony. That's the first time I've given my testimony. And I thought, now people know Paul Ritchie, his faith, with all its weaknesses, with all its struggles, with all its anxieties, with all its doubts. So that's me.
Yeah, and it's so important as I listen to you there, Paul, that we are truthful in our testimony, yeah. And it's so difficult because often we we want to show a certain side of things.
Yeah,
I was a bad person, we'll say. Then I came to Christ, and everything was good after that. But the world they're really looking at the truth, and if you're honest with people and open, and it's very difficult because when we are open to people, often we get hurt. So we
Yeah.
might be afraid of showing the side to us. And, I've quite a similar testimony to yourself, growing up in a Christian household, and before I was a teenager, giving my life, and then during the teenage years, being a bit of a coward, to be honest, being
Yeah, I was a
afraid.
total coward. Yeah.
People, we look at the gospel, and we look at the people close to Jesus and how they denied him. But I've denied Jesus so many times.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But I guess in our weaknesses, it shows the strength in the gospel, and that we need
it
to keep
does.
relying on that, and what Jesus has done for us.
And I think, John, one of the things about it is I'm really encouraged by 1 John 1, verse 8, which says, if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Sin is a current reality in our lives. And I think many of us have no problem admitting the sins that we did before we were Christians or in our past. But the fact that we still struggle with weakness is something that's much harder. And I think that there's a testimony in how God has changed our lives, but there's also a testimony in the God who reaches with grace into our messed up lives and, doesn't treat us as our sins deserve, but according to his loving kindness.
Yeah, that's so true. And Paul, just going on to the subject of writing, I believe for many years you've written a blog. Is that correct, Paul?
Yeah, it's called To Whom It May Concern, which I thought was clever at the time. It doesn't get many hits. It's sometimes quite boring because I have a tendency to use it to record sermons, as in keep a record, so that a blog's quite handy. You go somewhere else and you've only your computer with you. You can look up your blog and download one of your sermons if you had to do that to speak somewhere and so on. I try to do things other than sermons too. Mental health was one of them. And that really was what led to the book. So I used to blog. You can tell on a blog how many hits you're getting.
Yeah.
And I would blog on things like mental health. I had one that was called OCD and Me, because I struggle with OCD. And that got a lot of hits. And I had friends who would give positive feedback to it. And I thought, well, here's something that may be touching people that was worth thinking about writing on.
And did you notice that a lot of Christians have issues with this, and maybe it's not talked about it? Like, I guess in churches we talk a lot about, sins, and not necessarily in church, but we know the sins: lust, greed, anger, trusting in money too much, these kind of sins, relying. But we don't really talk about things like depression, anxiety, OCD.
I agree. And one of the books you obviously, when you're writing a book, you read a lot of other books. And one of the books that I found very helpful talked about the fact that depression and mental illness is rooted in the fall. And that actually there can be a bad theology in the church where people forget to see that we live in broken bodies. We were preaching through 1 Corinthians in our evening service, and we came to chapter 15. We live in perishable bodies. And you go back to the fall, and I think you've really got to root everything in the fall. And in the fall, death comes because of human sin. And everything is affected. And our brain is like any other organ of the body. Because of the fall, I'm going to get arthritis when I'm older. But because of the fall, my brain chemistry may not be properly functioning as well. And I think that there are many reasons why people get depressed. But one of those reasons is a physical result of the fall. In fact, not even just the physical brain chemistry issues and hereditary issues that go with depression, but even if you think of the other factors that contribute to depression, broken relationships. What happens after the fall in Genesis chapter 3? In Genesis chapter 4, Cain murders his brother Abel. And really ever since then, there's been broken relationships. And I know people in our church, because I've talked to a lot of people obviously about their depression, who have relational issues that have affected them. I think of one person I mentioned in the book, and her mother used to wake her up in the middle of the night when she was a teenager to tell her how awful she was. Well, obviously, that sort of input coming into someone's life is going to have a breaking effect on them. So one of the things in the book, one of the ideas of the book is that there are many reasons for depression. And when you try to then help people with depression or seek help for your own depression, you've got to have a sort of a multifaceted approach. Some of that can be medicine, because of it's an illness like any other illness. Some of that can be therapy to help you. I took cognitive behavior therapy, which helps the way you think about things. Some of that could be counseling. Some of that can be lifestyle. But you come at it with a multifaceted approach. And you'll see that the title of the book is It Unspiritual to be Depressed? That was a response to the fact that in the church, there can be a stigma about depression. And it seems that some people think you're less of a Christian if you're depressed. You can think of, say, John, the preacher who gets up and says, you should have joy in the Lord. How can you be depressed? And I've heard stories of people being given out to for taking tablets for their mental health, not realizing that we're rooted in the fall. Our brains can be broken. And that was one of the central chapters of the book is it unspiritual to be depressed? And I'll give the end away just, to answer that question. No, it's not. Many great Christians have struggled with depression in their own life. I think of people like Spurgeon, who struggled with depression, and I reference him as well. So that was sort of the centerpiece of the book, was just answering this question: is it unspiritual to be depressed? Some of the other questions, though, that exist in the Christian church would be: is it worth talking about your depression? Is it worth opening up to people? Is it okay to take medicines for your depression? I do, so I believe it is. How can you help your own depression? And also, how can you help other people's depression? How as a church can we respond to people with depression? Just another thing too, just there, John, we had a night one time where we had a neurologist in our church talk about mental health. And one of the amazing things after that was that two people from different cultures who were visiting the church that night said, in our culture, people don't get depressed. Now, that's not true. You can look up the World Health Organization statistics. Depression, they thought of depression as a Western thing. That's not true. And then the person we had speaking, the neurologist, was a guy called Elijah Chila, and he was talking about, in his own language at home, there isn't a word for depression. It's that much of a stigma. We had a lovely girl come to us one night in the house. She was talking about not feeling good. She talked about self-hatred. And I didn't know what she was talking about until I realized that she was talking about depression, but she didn't want to use the word. So there still is stigma. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's really important to be open about our struggles, because it's one of the ways to deal with the stigma of depression.
And Paul, while you were writing the book, was it like cathartic for you to write it and go through it and investigate,
Yes.
I guess, what the Bible says about it, what
Yeah.
God says about depression, and how as Christians should we face depression?
Well, Don, as you probably got by now, I'm a bit of a blatterer. So so I loved writing it. And like Caroline, my wife, has heard me talk about all these things so much. So it was like talking to the computer. And I did really enjoy sort of getting off my own chest, my feelings on these things and working through it. The funny thing too is, like, what happened, John, was I take Fridays off, and I went upstairs and I was on the computer looking up something. I was looking up the blog or something like that. And I started thinking, I wonder if there's a book in this. So I took all the blog posts that I'd written in depression and tried to figure out, how many words I had there and so on. And then I just started writing. I started writing, and I would ask, because I've OCD, I'm a little bit obsessive. So all the time that I had off, I was talking to people about depression issues. I've talked to GPs, psychologists. I've run this by a psychiatrist, theologians, and so on. People I knew, just asking their advice on this. And really, over about a 10-week period in my time off, I got the first draft of it done. And then I sent it off to friends and saw what they thought. And yeah, I had no idea if an unknown like myself would ever be able to get a book published. I'd known some people who'd had book published, so I thought maybe there's a chance. And then I sent off to a few publishers, and Christian Focus were kind enough to come back. And what you do with them is you send off a few chapters, and if they like those few, I cheated too, because you're supposed to send 2 sample chapters. So
Okay.
what I decided was I'll throw in the introduction and the foreword and the first 2 chapters as well. And they came back and they wanted to see the whole thing. And then after a few months, they came back and said they wanted to take it. And I was flabbergasted, because I've never written a book or anything like that before. So
Yeah,
that's how it came about.
that sounds great, Paul. So we're just talking about Paul's book here. Is it unspiritual to be depressed? And who do you think this book is for? Many people watching it might feel by the title that, if I guess we've ideas of depression. And when someone gets to that level of depression and they say, okay, I'm depressed now, or I'm diagnosed as being depressed or something like that. But if we talk about mental health, it's a range, and I think everyone
I
has to have
totally
mental
agree,
health.
John.
If you have physical health, you have mental health.
What I would say, John, is, like, obviously I'm going to try to get everyone to buy it. So I'm going to say it's for everybody. um, you know, but actually, like, one of the advantages we were talking about before we went on is it is a small book, so you don't have to be a big reader, and it is light. That's the way I tried to write it, and there's lots of stories in it, and so on. But there are some limitations. So, for example, what I'm trying to do is take away some of the stigma with mental health. I'm trying to address some of the issues of mental health. I'm not writing as a doctor. And so, like, I often tried to pretend like I was an expert on mental health. So I'd talk to someone and they'd say, oh, I'm on tablets for mental health. And I go, what do you take? They'd always tell me something. I knew nothing about, any of that. But I'm writing as a pastor. I'm writing as someone who struggles with their own mental health. And I'm writing with someone who's talked to a lot of people who struggle with their mental health. I would say that it's limited in terms of people with very severe mental health. This book isn't, going to solve the big questions of some of the more severe mental health. You're not going to read this book and go away and think, I now understand everything to do with mental health. And you're not going to read this book and suddenly be cured of your mental health. But I hope that you would read this book, and I think particularly with people with sort of moderate mental health issues, rather than severe mental health issues, I hope it'd be helpful to be severe. If you're severely struggling, that you would feel sympathy coming through with this book and some understanding. But this is not going to give you all the answers you need. So I would say for people with their own moderate to mental health, this would be a book that will be helpful. It's got some chapters on issues like, how does the gospel relate to what I'm going through? I've said already, should I take tablets? Should I go to the doctor? What about, and this is, you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, is it okay to go to a counselor who's not a Christian? And if so, how do I relate to them about my faith? What should I say? What should I not say? I'm going to say that they're going to see through you if you're hiding anything from them, and that there is a testimony in going. So when I went for counseling, my counselor wouldn't have been particularly religious, but I talked about all my sins and everything inside me, because I felt that there's a testimony in saying, I'm broken and I'm flawed, but my faith isn't built on me being together. My faith is built on a God who's gracious towards me. And so, there are issues like that. There's a chapter for those who are loving people with mental health. So maybe you have friends who struggle with mental health. So you might have people in your church with mental health. What are some of the things to say and not to say about them? And also, I like a bit of theology. I'm no brain in these things. But again, looking at things like how the fall affects our mental health. I also wrote the book with some of my friends who wouldn't be interested in Christianity in mind. I wrote it as a book that I thought, I have friends who would say they're not particularly interested in Christianity, but they're my friends who would read a book on this issue, because I wrote it. And I thought, I will write it in a way that shows something of the gospel and how the gospel makes sense and how the gospel is attractive, even though it doesn't give you simple answers to all these things. There is a chapter too, on my reflections of a friend's son who died by suicide, and some of the questions that were raised there. There's a talk too on my own struggle where I was worried that I was beyond God's forgiveness. You might not feel that you're diagnosed with mental health issues, but you may struggle with assurance of your salvation and so on. So, of course, I'm going to tell you it's for everybody. But I think it'll be most effective to those who have mild to moderate depression, most effective to those who are Christians, and most effective also to people who love those people.
Yeah, no, I think it's good as Christians to look at these subjects, and the more books we get in of many different topics, you see that Christianity has to be a part of everything, as in it touches every aspect, and there's no, whatever someone is going through, Christianity has something to say about it, because it has to, if it's the truth about everything, it has to be connected to everything,
Exactly,
so it's great to talk about this, and it's great to talk about Paul about his book here. So the title is It Unspiritual to be Depressed? And it's coming out next week, the 14th of January, and you can get copies, and we'll send them out to people straight away. So we'll put the links below the video as well. And we've been taking pre-orders, and I can say on this video, it's officially so far it's officially the bestseller on ChalkSolas.ie for pre-orders.
I'm going to try and find somewhere I can boast about that.
So a Teach Solas bestseller, you can put, the way they put New York.
I'm going to go down to Patrick Street, and I'm going to walk up to someone and say, "You might not know me. My name's Paul Ritchie. I'm the bestseller on Teach Solas Christian Bookshop."
Exactly, that's it. So talking about books, as we are a Christian bookshop, Paul, do you have any recommendations for our viewers?
I do. So there's some books on your site that I thought would be worth recommending. Actually, it's a brilliant site, John. You have lots of good stuff. And we were talking beforehand as well that, if someone wants to order a book that isn't on the site, you're willing to get it in. Isn't that right?
Yeah, so exactly. We get a lot of custom orders. So yeah.
And your prices are very good as well. I'm trying to give you a plug here.
Thanks.
And also, there was one woman in church, and she said she wanted the book, and she texted me. She said, "I can't figure out, like, the site works well." She said, "I can't figure out how to do it." So I was in her house, and I said, "Look, I'll do it for you." And she wanted like 5 copies of the book, and she said, I said, "Well, that's free postage over €25." She was delighted about that. But books, I looked up on your site. There's a few books. The first guy I want to mention is this guy here. This is David Robertson, his name. You've got 3 of his books that I can see, if not more, on the website. And the funny thing is, I wanted to have all 3 of these books with me. But I've obviously, there's the other 2 I've given to people and they haven't come back. I actually searched my son's room to see if I could find his. I'll leave this one to the end. The first one I want to recommend is Ask. Okay. Ask is a brilliant book. And Ask is really a book that's aimed at teenagers. But if you're like me and you're conscious of not knowing a lot about a lot of things, he covers about 40 questions, everything from the doctrine of hell. How can a loving God send people to hell? To how we relate to science, he had one chapter about how to relate to someone from a Buddhist background. And I was able to give that chapter I got a girl in our church who's Malaysian, and she grew up Buddhist and had become a Christian just before coming here. They're aimed at teenagers, but they have content. I'm hoping to I will at some stage order 3 copies from you, because I'm hoping for each of my 3 kids to read this book. It can be hard to get teenagers to read, but also it's a brilliant book for adults to read. I read any book. Like, I read anything that will give me information, and often books aimed at younger audiences are perfect because, do you know what, John, sometimes you should know what something's about, but you're too embarrassed to ask. Because by our stage we should know. Anyway, that's the first one. Then the second one he has is a tiny book. It's even smaller than my book, and it's called Dawkins Letters, the Dawkins Letters. Now, what he did there was he wrote a letter to Richard Dawkins. I think Dawkins wrote back once, and then Dawkins ignored him. But there are a series of letters written to Richard Dawkins dealing with, in particular, his book, The God Delusion. Now, I know that in some ways, new atheism is sort of dying out, but it's a really good book. It's accessible. It's really an enjoyable read. It's the sort of book that will boost your faith, and also a great book to give to your friends. And it's a small book. It's a cheap book. It's a great book. I've bought a number of copies of this book because it's a book I like to try and give away to people. And then there's this one. So after he wrote the Dawkins letters, he wrote this one, but rather than writing to Dawkins, it was Hitchens he was writing to, the other atheist. Hitchens didn't engage with him at all, but Hitchens wrote a book, I think, was God's Not Great.
Yes.
And so what he did here is he's trying to deal with the objections that Hitchens has as to the character of God. And while in some senses the concept is not new, I didn't think the concept of writing the letters was as good this time round because Hitchens hadn't really engaged with it. This is a beautiful book. It's really good in terms of your confidence in the character of God, and in particularly the person of Jesus. And I've always thought in my own faith, there's two things I really need to be confident about. God exists, I need to know that, and that God is good. Because if God exists and he's not good, then there's no comfort in it. And the first Dawkins one, the Dawkins letters, really is about God existing, and a really credible case for that. And then the second one, the Magnificent Obsession, is really a reminder that God is good and Jesus is a beautiful person. And then I have two other ones. Evangelism as Exiles. I saw this one. This is a really interesting one. What I love about this book is that I think that we're living in a sort of post-Christian society. And I think that those people who still hang on to the idea that somehow we're a Christian country end up feeling embittered because they think, you know what, this is supposed to be a Christian country and everything's going against Christianity. The truth of the matter is we were never called to live in a Christian country. We were called to live as exiles. And that's the biblical model. And he talks about living as a Christian in a non-Christian world. And ours is no longer, I don't know if it was ever a Christian society, really, in terms of personal faith, but that's a huge debate, I think many other books. But you know what I mean? But this is really good because it comes and he's talking about relating to people. I'd give you one of the stories, but, well, I will. One of the stories that I found really interesting was he was working in an unnamed Middle Eastern country, and it was around the time of the September 11th attacks. And the only people he had got to know really well on a sort of faith basis were a bunch of lecturers. And the lecturers came in and they said to him, of course, you know that George Bush set up those September 11th attacks. And it was all just an excuse to invade Afghanistan. He's American, by the way. Now, he realized at that stage that he's got one of two options. He can step in and defend his country and get into an argument of politics, or he can leave it go as an exile and keep focused on the gospel. And that's what he chose to do. He didn't let it, you know, it's that sort of 1 Corinthians 9 idea, being all things to all people. He wasn't going to let anything, including his love for his country, get in the way of him sharing the good news about Jesus. And this is a really wise book about sharing our faith. And then the last one's a classic, Mere Christianity. And John, I know as a pastor who's 49 now, I should have read this book years ago, and I didn't. I only read it this year. It's fantastic. It's a series of lectures given just before during World War II. It's a brilliant book. It is a book that has I have a couple of friends reading it actually, and they were skeptical about other stuff that I gave them, but they're enjoying this. It's so well argued. My only complaint about it, John, was that I kind of felt near the end he had said all that he should have said, and he was obviously contracted for 40 lectures or whatever, and he starts going on to other topics, and you go, you know what, if you'd stopped at chapter 30 or whatever it is, it might be a better book. But great book, really classic, worth, not always easy. I'm not, I'm no weighty intellectual or anything like this. I like my books straightforward, but not always easy, but very rewarding.
Yeah,
and that's my book.
Mere Christianity is a great book. I must read. It's been a few years since I read it, so I must reread it sometime maybe in the new year. C.S. Lewis is always, a great author, and the other books as well. That the Ask book you were talking about, that's sold quite well for teens. There's another book, 10 Questions Every Teen Should Ask and Answer by Rebecca McLaughlin.
Is that Rebecca McLaughlin?
Yeah, I've read the adults version, Confronting Christianity, of that, which is a great book as well.
And when I saw that on the site, that was a book I thought would be worth getting as well.
Yeah. So yeah, we like to have a broad range, and definitely we're going to try to get more teen books as well, because there's always people looking for books for teens. I know they mightn't read them, but as adults as well, we can read them, and the Ask one, they're quite short chapters, so people can jump in. And if you've got a specific question, you can look at that section. So that's quite good. Yeah,
I thought the Ask book's fantastic, and I do think, like, those of us who are parents, parenting sometimes makes you feel guilty. You don't know what to do in terms of relating your faith to your children and so on. And I just think this is a book I'm pushing for my kids to read, because Ask is, there's some great questions in there, and it's got enough meat that it's not patronizing.
And I think all the questions are asked by teenagers as well. They sent in their questions. Yeah, so that's a good one for teens. So yeah, we'll put the link underneath the video of all those different titles, so people can look them up as well and purchase them on teachsolas.ie. Just before we go, I just want to thank you, Paul, for your time.
It's a pleasure.
And thanks for choosing teachsolas.ie for pre-orders for your book. We're very happy to share books by Irish authors and sell Irish authors, that's one of our main goals here. So all the best, Paul, and hope to see you in the new year sometime. We'll visit you in Limerick. And
and I'll get down to Cork sometime and see you in Tracy.
Exactly. Come down to Cork, the real capital, So just want to thank all our viewers here today. As I said, that we will have the links below for Paul's book and any other titles that we've mentioned in this as well. And just subscribe and share this video with a friend as well. And see you next time. God bless.
God bless you.